What is up, gamers? It's been a minute since we've done this, but this is going to be a tier list based on set 11. So a lot of this is kind of predictions and looking at results and just my own personal take of what the meta will look like for standard. And this should be what you should be looking to playtest for during a lot of BCS season. We're going to be in this format for about a month before set 12 comes out. So yeah, as of the release of this video, 50 Cards is doing a oversupply sale on his website. He is giving away a ton of stuff, and if you use code FLAIR, you can get a discount on your order. And back to the video. First up, Eugene. It's pretty rough. Anytime Eugene gets support, it's really lackluster. Bov, probably like tier 2, I would say. She has a really strong advantage engine through Samadhi plus re-equipping Spear, and then Bov being able to consistently soul charge and revive units off of that, and then Spear letting you draw a card every time. So she's not terrible. There's just decks that are basically doing what she's doing already, but better. She just has like a mix of everything from a bunch of different decks by being able to retire stuff, draw stuff, gain a ton of power, all that, but she really just struggles at being the best at something. She used to be the best at having a really strong front row, but now there's a deck that is doing that but way better. Next up is the Nirvanas, probably both 2.5. They keep giving this deck random stuff, and it's not like the stuff by itself is like necessarily bad. It's just that they don't really work together. Now Mira's Virina is a really good step up for Java, and Mahar is just doing like the same thing it's always been doing, but I don't know, it's not doing enough. Like, there's a bunch of different paths you can take the deck where you can be super defensive or super like high roll all gas, but both of those don't feel that great. You can do like a mid-range deck, and that's felt the best for Java. Or shockingly enough, you can play sort of like a Highlander deck where you just play a bunch of different Virina forms, and then you run the Prayer Dragon that lets you search for any Overdress unit or Trickstar, and then the Prayer Dragon that like searches top 5 for Virina. So then you have like options for every scenario, but it's just not doing enough. It's so casual in what it's doing. Overlord, probably 1.5. It's just Overlord. It's doing what it's always been doing. Drive checking 4 times a turn, restanding once, hitting crits, having on-hit pressure through Brachial Force, having really big shield through Madoka. Overlord's just been doing the same thing for the past year, so and it's still like really good at what it does. Shoujo Doji, I think Shoujo Doji isn't that bad right now because of the new support he got in set 11. I think he's tier 2. I'm gonna go ahead and put Snake there. I think they're about the same. I haven't tried Snake as much, but I think the grade 1 and grade 2 that Shoujo Doji got in set 11 are really good. Now that can actually like play a mid-range style or like a tempo style where they're just like building a field really fast early on to be super aggressive with, and then they're able to clear the field out through Shoujo Doji shoving things to soul and the new grade 1 going into soul, and now it has an easier time bot decking things and finding its pieces through the grade 2, where it just made Shoujo Doji be a lot smoother and not feeling like a rough game plan. Snake is gonna be a more aggressive version of Shoujo Doji. The only like kind of issue I can see with Snake is that it doesn't have as easy of a time to clear its field like Shoujo Doji does during mid-battle phase. So after you pass the turn over to, let's say, Gandiva or any deck with any field removal, then Snake will have a tough time because it will lose all of its board, and then it has to try to rebuild from there to be able to push for aggression. So I think honestly, Shoujo Doji's probably better right now than Snake, but it's still not doing enough. It doesn't have like the strongest end game yet. Once Shoujo Doji can get like a really strong finisher, then the deck will be really, really good. Next, Gandiva, probably best deck in format. It's a very easy to pilot deck, and it's just gonna do the same thing every time where it board wipes, draws a ton of cards, gains a ton of power, and you don't really have to think about it that hard. Now, there are like different sequences that like raises the ceiling of the deck, which the deck does have like a little bit of a skill ceiling, but for the most part, it's going to be doing the same thing every time. Next is actual decks that like got direct support in the set. So Tamayura, I think Tamayura is 1.5. It's pretty solid. The biggest thing is against like Gandiva, you can keep clearing your field and basically protecting your important rear guards by putting them in the soul, and then Gandiva can't retire them and gets no value out of Best Harvest like ever in this matchup. And the new Tamayura is just like really solid for the deck because you're able to keep the plus 5k power that the original Tamayura gave, and also it lets you consistently find the orders you need. So you still want to play Broken Toys because it's able to find all your pieces very quickly. But now the grade 3 order from set 8 is really important in here because you're going to be basically clearing your field every single turn. You want to be able to have an easy way to get those back, so you can play the order, and the order is able to call out half a field at least, and potentially more depending on like how much Counterblast you have and how much you want to use. But also Tamayura not requiring Counterblast to call things out anymore is just really, really big. One of the biggest issues the deck had before was it used too much Counterblast because of original Tamayura and the 2 grade 1 dolls. And now that this Tamayura doesn't require you to use Counterblast, you're basically using 1 Counterblast a turn because you have a doll that countercharges once. It's pretty good. The deck hits pretty decent numbers also now. The like main issue it has is it doesn't have much of an early game. Your early game is basically calling dolls out and then shoving them in the soul to protect them later on. But once you reach turn 4, then the deck gets insanely strong where you start generating a ton of cards for free, and you hit really hard with 5 attacks pretty easily. So yeah, I think it's still like a pretty solid deck, even with the bit of a lack of an early game. Next is one of the new decks, which is Vermilion. I think Vermilion's like tier 2. Vermilion's pretty interesting. It binds rear guards, but there isn't really much in the meta that really cares about the rear guards being bound, because a lot of the meta decks is kind of warped around, can it handle Gandiva, and can it deal with having its board retired naturally? So just based on that, a lot of the decks on the top are going to naturally be really okay with the field being removed, and a lot of them don't care if the things get bound either. The one cool thing Vermilion has is it has a really insane ceiling where, because of Rising Phoenix, you're able to call it out during mid-battle phase a lot. The deck, I think, is missing like one potential card that puts it over the edge because it has a really solid foundation. It just doesn't have enough to like get it over the finish line just yet. Next is the Mushashid armor. It got support this set. It's still like whatever. It's more so just like a casual budget thing, which I'm a big fan of. But if you're planning on taking it to a tournament, I wish you luck. Next is Bruce, original Bruce. So original Bruce is probably like here. It's kind of in the same boat as Tamayura, but worse, because Tamayura can actually like sorta do things early on. Bruce just can't. And in a lot of decks right now, they are trying to like push you really hard early, and aggression is pretty important in this format, unless your late game is just so insanely powerful that it doesn't matter, which I think Bruce's late game is overshadowed by some decks at this point. Barrow, kind of same thing. A lot of the decks at the top right now don't really care about the board being wiped and being shoved in the soul by Barrow anymore, and you still like have those games where you just don't hit 15 soul. The one big thing this deck does have is it can hit 5 attacks on grade 3, but you have to just basically annihilate your hand, and then if you went second, any deck just kind of like rolls you over on the Persona Ride turn. So yeah, I think Barrow's just pretty whatever right now. This thing, pretty casual. Doesn't do enough as a Vanguard. Greedon, so we'll go ahead and bring Greedon Masks over here too. So honestly, a lot of people have been saying that Greedon Masks is bad, and then a lot of people have been saying Greedon Masks is really good. I don't really know if it's better than the OG Greedon, but just based on like what I remember from OG Greedon, it was like tier 2, and I'm just gonna put Greedon Masks with it. I think it's probably like sort of similar, because the big thing Masks does over normal Greedon is you're able to like attack with more than just your Vanguard and 1 rear guard. You're at least able to have like a second rear guard you can attack with, and it can also search for your Desire Devil pieces, and you're able to get Persona Ride off of it. So it's like a very different build from what Greedon is trying to do, but I think they both end up being similar in power level. I don't think one's better than the other, from my understanding, but I'm open to being told about Greedon Masks. I haven't seen enough of this deck to really know what fully it's doing, but I do know normal Greedon is still like a pretty solid deck that can just sack you out of the game extremely easily. Next is Fafnir. With the like deck set, maybe it's here, but it's not really doing anything better than any of the decks above it. It's a restanding Vanguard that has a bit of retire, but you know what does that also? Overlord does. And Overlord does it at a lot better because you're able to keep your drive checks, unlike Fafnir. So I don't know. It doesn't seem that great just yet. Lukier, probably tier 2. It got really solid support in set 11 by basically giving them a purple trapezist. Just like, it still sort of suffers from having its field retired, which Gandiva does pretty easily, even though you're able to clear 2 spots. I don't know, I think the deck still struggles a bit. It also has a lack of an early game. Your early game is basically calling Rising Dragon and filtering off of that. You don't really gain power. And then the late game it does have isn't as strong as a lot of the late games that the decks above it have. But it's still like a decent deck for the most part. Baphomedes, I guess, tier 3? I've never seen this deck in action, so I don't know. Chronojet 1.5. I think it's still really good. Like, it's probably the top of the 1.5s, but Gandiva just like rocks its shit because Jet hates having its board retired, which is why Wellstro was good against it, because it could like blow up its field every turn and minus its power really hard. But like, Jet's still Jet. Even if we get the Brainwash restriction with GG, it's still gonna be like up here. The one interesting thing is the like new Devil package, which Jet can like search all of it. I mean, I've seen that deck top a few times, and I'm pretty intrigued on like how good that deck actually is. I'll probably look into it more later on. But yeah, either way, Jet's still doing the same thing it's been doing all Springfest. So yeah. Vehemence, probably like tier 2. It's weird. It's kind of in the same boat as like the Snake, where it has a really solid like turn 3, and the turn 3 is like pretty good. But then Gandiva just board wipes it, and it's just a struggle train from then on. And then the Diabolos cards, there aren't enough of them that like actually plus you. There's Jamil, which lets you call something, and that's about it. Now, the power this deck can reach is really, really high. It's just not strong enough to be able to like keep up with the mass retiring pinpoint retire that a lot of these decks up here have. Jeweled Masks, I think it's also tier 2. I do think it's a strict upgrade compared to like original Jeweled, and English is finally getting Impusa, so the deck is gonna actually be like pretty solid now. Being able to reduce power to 1, retire 2 things, gaining a crit, and pretty easily having 5 attacks is pretty good. The like main thing I'm wondering is how much Impusa changes, and the big thing this deck just lacks is like generating advantage. A lot of the decks above it have ways to like gain cards in their hand. Your Jeweled Masks doesn't really. They don't have easy ways to draw cards, and they don't have easy ways to call rear guards. But the power and pressure this deck can have is really insane. It's just once this deck falls behind, it feels like it's really hard for this deck to come back for a win without sacking a little bit. So yeah, tier 2 seems like a good spot. Astrea, probably tier 2.5. I haven't seen it much. It's just like Masks doesn't add a ton to the deck. You still run it because it's like a way to try to end the game, but it's still like pretty inconsistent because you have to like find all your critical triggers, put them in the soul. In some games, you'll just like not hit. You'll just miss everything. So I think it's probably here. It having a pretty big restand turn during your Masks play is still pretty solid. So I can see that doing well. But other than that, it's just like, eh. Chaos. I think Chaos 1.5. I think this deck is still heavily underrated. I've seen what it can do now, and it's pretty crazy. So the new Chaos does so much for the deck because now it can give power to your Mikanis during main phase. So now you're able to like set up your grade 3 Mikanis, and they'll have Persona Ride power plus the Chaos power. So then they'll be swinging for 33, and then they'll be restanding at 33 and being able to swing again. And then you play that grade 1 that gives it 2-card Guard Restrict. So then you're able to have these Mikanis just like be insanely powerful. And then once you use your grade 3 Mikanis, you're able to get them again through grade 1 Mikani. I think this deck has a lot going for it because you're also able to just protect your grade 3 Mikanis from being board wiped because they go into soul, which at first seemed like a bad thing, but right now in this meta, it's a really important thing that Chaos has in its arsenal. So I think it's 1.5. The amount of pressure it brings is really insane. The grade 3 Chaos just generates you advantage because you're able to add a card to hand and call a card and put one in the soul. So for discarding one, you get a card on field and a card in your hands, so you're able to find more things. So yeah, I think Chaos is really good. Bastion, tier 2.5. This deck can still just like high roll you out of the game, but it's late game. There's another deck in this nation that has a way better late game than Bastion has. Bastion did just get the promo that lets you superior ride Prime, so potentially that like speeds up the deck enough to make it like tier 2, but overall it's just not doing enough right now. It hasn't really gotten good support in a while. They keep giving it like high rarity spots, but those cards aren't really adding too much to Bastion, and it doesn't like fix the problems it has of it not having an early game, having no shield value. And yeah, now the Owl promo is pretty good because it does have shield and you're able to refuel your prime cost, but it's still just like not enough to like make this deck I feel better than anything above it. MLB, probably tier 2. It having 15k power is pretty solid, and you're able to like gain so many cards. Like this deck shockingly has some of the biggest card advantage out of any decks in standard right now. Just its like power ceiling isn't as strong as some of the other decks. It also doesn't like having its board retired as much. Now it is, because of how much card advantage it is getting, it is able to rebuild its field kind of consistently. But yeah, for the most part, MLB just kind of, just a solid deck. PBO kind of in the same spot. It's really aggressive, which is pretty good because a lot of these decks up here don't really have much of an early game. They're like really big combo decks, and a lot of the effects need you to be at grade 3 in order to use them. And PBO can really take advantage of that because it's able to just vomit out a board out of nothing and then just have a ton of drive checks between itself and Blaster Dark swinging, so you can sack people out of the game. So yeah, I think it's like pretty solid. I do think if this deck doesn't get a big enough advantage early on though, any of these decks above it will just run it over. Next up, Youthbook, 1.5, maybe 2. It's weird. He's like in between, I think. He still is doing Youthbook things. He has a decent early game. He has the best early game out of any of the decks up here other than maybe Jet. And you're able to just like draw a ton of cards, but sometimes this deck will just like fall over to itself. It'll just brick, and you really need to find all your pieces pretty fast in order to keep up with a lot of these decks up here, because the big thing these decks up here have is they can find their pieces easily, or they have so many just like copies of just different pieces they need that it doesn't matter, or they just don't need pieces. And Youthbook needs to find a lot of its things by turn 3, and the power level this deck brings isn't that high. It does almost gain the most card advantage in out of any deck up here. I think the big thing Youthbook probably lacks is a finishing play. It doesn't have a turn where it's like, all right, I'm gonna kill you. The best thing it has is Gust having 2 drive checks, which like Overlord does that, but Overlord's also like clearing your field in the process and doing this turn 3. So I don't know. I think it's pretty rough. The one big thing this deck does have is it can find its Persona Ride so easily. And then once you hit Persona Ride, this deck can do a number. It's just, it doesn't have a unit to go with that Persona Ride to be able to just close out a game. Graham Grace, probably 2.5. I haven't seen enough of this deck to really know. Could be tier 2. I can't see it being anything higher than tier 2. But 2.5 seems pretty decent. I do know the like big thing this does do is having the Persona Ride power be given the back row as well. And that's like a really big deal, especially with one of them being able to attack. It also clears itself, and it can probably have a bit of an early game by playing the early game cards like Kybre. So I can see this being like a pretty solid like tempo style of deck. But yeah, I think it's just maybe not doing enough. I don't know. I don't know enough to really give a good analysis of this deck. Minerva! I think Minerva's tier 1. This deck is kinda silly. What changed with this? Now, Minerva probably has the highest ceiling in standard right now, and it can pretty consistently get there. So the big thing that changed with this deck is the new grade 1 it got in set 11. It's able to clear itself and put it into soul to draw, or not to draw, to put a Genesis unit from drop to hand, so you're able to refuel your Persona Rides. You're able to find your Angelicas to extend more. There's just a lot it can do. But the other big thing is whenever it's placed on rearguard, you can +1, so +1 draw, and then call a card from your hand down. It's pretty interesting. So the big thing this can do is it can like send your Camomeals back into soul, so then you can soul blast them out later on, and you're able to just actually like have an insane ceiling. Like, it's not uncommon for this deck to have like 6+ attacks. And then if you're on Persona Ride turn, then you'll have plus 15k because of Minerva giving power itself. You're able to have a restanding Vanguard. You have multiple camo meals constantly being called every turn, and then you refuel them back into your soul through the new grade 2 and Drilling Angel. This deck is just able to have such an insane ceiling of attacks. It feels pretty unstoppable sometimes. The one thing this does lose to is damage triggers. So a lot of what you can do is this deck doesn't have like the strongest early game. So if you can get through the early game by taking as little damage as possible while still being able to like do all your plays with all the Cow Blasts you need, then on the big combo turn, you're able to just tank some damage. And if you hit one damage trigger, the turn is still like pretty scary because you still need a 1-card guard everything. But if you find a second damage trigger, then most of the attacks of this turn get shut down. So it's pretty interesting. I do think because of just like the raw sheer power this has, and one of the few ways to beat it is through getting lucky, I do think that's still like really insanely strong for this deck. And it's very consistent at doing everything it wants to do. So yeah, I think it's tier 1. Maybe some people would say it's 1.5, but I think it's better than everything under here. So yeah, Hexa Orb. I still think Hexa Orb's pretty good. I think 1.5 is a good spot for it. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. The ways to restand pretty easily is pretty good. Having triple drive, pretty good. And you just gain so much power, and you're able to stack your deck to gain that power really easily. This deck just has like a bit of everything where it can play kind of early, and then its late game is pretty solid because if you like hit a front trigger, then you give plus 20k to your front row. Pretty good. I do think its issue will show up whenever you're facing like Gandiva, because this deck also doesn't like generate a ton of advantage. Its advantage is getting extra drive checks. And not a lot of the cards in the deck actually like draw cards. So if your board gets like wiped at all by Gandiva, then it can be kind of hard to recover. But outside of that, it's able to like compete with everything else within its tier. Survivon tier 3, it doesn't do enough. The coolest thing it has is it has like has 5 attacks on turn 3, and it has a plus 5k boost to board. If you have a full field, you kind of have Persona Ride active already. But you need a full field to activate that. This deck just doesn't generate any advantage. It has a really solid like attack combo because of it being able to like call more things out mid-battle phase. But outside of that, you just aren't getting enough stuff. Thagreia, I think, is 1.5. This is one of the silliest late games ever because you're able to double Persona Ride. You have the order in play that makes your Persona Rides give 15k power and you draw 2 cards. So just by reaching turn 4, you gain plus 30k power and draw 4 cards. It's pretty absurd. It's pretty funny though. And then you're usually using the Dark Thagreia as your copy. So you're able to restand your Vanguard, and then plus you have maples that just revive themselves as soon as you ride. So just for existing and playing your deck, you're going to be swinging with your Vanguard twice for 56k plus. And you can potentially like raise the ceiling even higher by running the grade 3 that gives your Vanguard a drive check. So then you swing for 3 drive, then 2 drive, and then you just draw so many cards off of that. Just like the one big thing is you need this deck to like get there and still have its pieces in order to like compete. But like that's not an insanely hard task because you have your grade 2 maple that lets you just recur cards back into your hand. And then once you reach turn 4, then you just draw a ton of cards and you just recoup all your losses anyway. By how I'm making it sound, it could go up here, but there are chances where like the counterplay for this deck is kind of similar to Minerva, where because this deck doesn't have like that strong of an early game, the opponent can make sure they make it through the early game and try to like not take too much damage, and then they can tank a lot of your just really high powered attacks since they're all 1 crit unless you sack triggers off Dark Thagreia. On the following turn for the opponent, if you drew a bunch of like duds or grade 3s, because this deck has to run a lot of 0 shield cards, so they kind of build a fake hand a little bit. But yeah, the opponent can hit really hard right back. Not as hard as you did, but still hard enough to where like if Thagreia drew a bunch of 0 shield cards, then it'll just die. So there is potential for this deck to just have like a fake hand kind of, even after you draw a bunch of cards. Next is Ezel. I think tier 2. A lot of people were scared of this deck like being really insane because you hit Persona Ride if you go first, you hit Persona Ride while your opponent is grade 2. But this deck doesn't have ways to multi-attack on that turn. So like that Persona Ride turn is not any stronger than like what Gandiva's turn 3 is looking like. And then against decks where they want you to be at grade 3, so like Gandiva is able to multi-attack once the opponent's at grade 3, it's just like you accelerate them a bit. Or like any of the Stride decks, they can Stride against you right afterwards. It still can just like be fast enough where it kills the opponent, but it's not like a guaranteed thing all the time. All right, off to Brantgate. Gravidia, probably tier 2 still. This deck can still just like sack you out of the game. Overtrigger is a hell of a card. Eldo Breath is a hell of a card. Having 2 Eldo Breaths is even more of a hell of a card. So yeah, can still play very aggressively. A lot of these decks up here sort of struggle a little bit to being rushed, and Gravidia being able to rush them and also like constantly retire rear guards is pretty solid. Having a Pot of Greed as soon as you ride is pretty good. The deck is still doing what Gravidia does. Next is Prison. So even counting with the new promo, I don't know. This, I think it's 2.5. I think a lot of the decks up here can deal with having to pay like resource tax, or they don't care enough about their rear guards where they just like, they don't care enough to bring them back and they'll just like kill you anyway. Or like in Thagrea's case, its late game is just stronger than Pure Lights anyway, so it doesn't super care. And these decks can like some of these decks can sort of clear the field anyway. The types of decks that Pure Light wants to deal with don't really exist in the top spots. I think it can like kind of shit on Minerva a bit, but Minerva can play and not like, they don't need to call things early on for this deck to function. And that's like the big thing. Most of these decks don't need to call things early on in order to like try to win the game, right? Most of them already really don't that much. Even with the promo, it's just, the promo just gives you access to more Pure Lights, which is fine. One of the worst feelings with this deck is when you don't find a second Pure Light. But like outside of that, it's kind of whatever. Every time this deck gets support, it's so mediocre. Ava, still 1.5. Ava's super interesting. The one big thing is like, it can deal with Gandiva retire because of Obscudade's not being able to be retired, and this deck is still like pretty tanky and it can filter. The new cards it got don't really add much. Now, if English doesn't lose Combine Rusher, then with the new Ava, it can still be like pretty good, and you're able to consistently bring back Combine Rushers to be aggressive with. But I don't think that would be like much better than what Ava's already doing. Ava's just doing what it's doing best. Having high crit swings, having a really tanky setup, constantly pluses through being able to call Obscudade and being able to filter a card into your hand through Ava skill. You filter your deck to have more triggers so you can sack more easily. Things like that. It also has Eldo Breath, which is not a good card to have in a game. Orphist. I think Orphist is tier 2. It's kind of in the same boat as PBO, where this has a really, really strong early game, and it can like beat over people pretty hard. A lot of the decks up here don't care. They don't like being rushed at all. The big thing is this deck can brick harder than like PBO can, so I think it'd be like a little bit worse than that, but its turn 3 ceiling is really, really high, and you can just vomit out a field of Shadow Army tokens, and it just like runs people over sometimes. You can brick pretty hard by either not finding enough orders or finding too many orders, and you will just like flop over and die. So yeah, I think Orphist is tier 2. It can still like sack some of these decks, but other than that, it's not doing much better. Hopefully Orphist Masks like does some really insane things with this. Heroes, tier 3, maybe tier 2.5. Heroes have a lot of shield value, and it can kind of help deal with some of the like insane pressure some of these decks up here can do, but it doesn't like having its field being wiped by Gandiva, and like the pressure it brings isn't nearly as much as some of these other decks. But Bold Salos was a good card for this in set 9, and if this can get like one more like really good card, I think this deck could be pretty decent. And if it has like something you want to search for through your bases, so yeah, I think heroes are pretty okay. Welstra, I think the age of Welstra is not as strong anymore. I think it's probably tier 2. Yes, we are confirmed to get Assembler, which is really big for this deck. The reason why Welstra was good was because it dumpstered on Jet, but some of the issues Welstra has is still like there. If Welstra goes second, it's not nearly as threatening, because Welstra's like turn 4 is not insane as a lot of the other turn 4s up here. Basically, Welstra just has like, it's Gandiva, but worse. Because Gandiva can play going second. Welstra really struggles going second. It really needs a bunch of its pieces and orders in order to survive. And this deck is very weak early. You basically have to find Lubetzel in order to call something. And then you also need you draw a card off of it, which can turn into shield value. You need to operate it to try to find more things. But just like, it's just a worse Gandiva because the power loss that Welstra like does, Gandiva just gains. The like only thing Welstra has over Gandiva is when going first, you're able to just, you still get your multi-attack when going first, unlike Gandiva. So you can still like do your Frey Shoots maximum stuff, but this deck just like needs so much to go right in order to win. Now, this deck is still like pretty good. Like when things go right, it will feel very unfair. It's pretty rough getting there sometimes. This deck really just needs like more ways to like find your pieces within like unit slots. So then you actually have like more shield value. It's just like very hard for this deck because you need to run so much, you need to find so much. It's just very awkward for it. Eldegomas, tier 3. This deck's funny. That's about it. Like didn't really get much good stuff in set 11, so it's still basically doing the same thing. Now what it was doing was already like pretty solid. I still think it'd be like tier 2 and it can compete with like other decks within tier 2, but once you go higher, this deck kind of struggles a bit more. The like biggest thing is that the researchers are able to like find persona rides and find like the specific monsters you want. Just like the quality of monsters though isn't as high as we would like it to be. If it had like one more monster that like was just a really massive beater, then I think that helped this deck a lot. But most of the monsters are just like utility based for the most part. Messiah, I think it's 1.5. It has a really insane late game once you get there. Now, yes, it hates getting its field retired, so Gandiva rocks its shit. But a lot of the aggressive decks are in tier 2, and you shouldn't be expecting them as much as before. So 1.5 is like, a lot of these decks don't have like the strongest early game, and neither does tier 1. Like Jet has a good early game, Youthbook can have a good early game, Tamayura can, but yeah. Anyway, Messiah doesn't like aggro and doesn't like its field being retired because this deck doesn't do anything till it strides. And any deck that can grade 2 game against it will just like really hurt this deck, which basically any other deck can grade 2 game against this because this doesn't have an early game. But once you reach stride turns, then the deck can be a lot better because you're able to basically draw 6 cards every turn. You're able to like bind certain rearguards the opponent has and just remove them from the game entirely. So like, but yeah, once you get to late game and start drawing a billion cards, then this deck can be pretty good. And then also you have Crest Power giving a ton of power. You have 5 attacks every turn, with all of them being like 30k plus on the first stride, and then afterwards it just keeps increasing. Messiah's like, okay. Vanguard, I think it's 1.5 also. This deck can be pretty fast, and then once you reach Persona Ride turn, you have basically almost like the Greya levels of power with a restanding Vanguard as well. It's like the Greya, but with a little bit less power, but a bit more consistency with it. Vanguard is gonna be a bit faster at what it's doing. Its turn 3 is a lot stronger than the Greyas. You can just have like insane pressure through dusting. If the opponent only has the Sanctitude in their hand, then Vanguard really takes advantage of that. It's super consistent because of the grade 2 promo, which we don't know if we're getting in English yet. If we do, this deck like is really good. If not, it might be like tier 2. But yeah, the grade 2 promo like basically guarantees all the set orders you need at all times. And it's also a 20k beater. And you can also potentially be aggressive depending on what your grade 2 lineup is. And Hathaway just replacing itself whenever you play it is really good. It's just like a very solid deck all around. The only issue it can potentially run into is missing Persona Ride. Other than that, this deck just kind of has like a bit of everything. It also doesn't really have a really strong advantage engine. You can draw a ton of cards off of it if you like hit draw triggers off Vanguard, if you call a bunch of Hathaways, and off Vanguard's skill himself just drawing you a card. And you also don't really need that many rearguards in order for this deck to be at basically full power. So it doesn't care as much about its field being retired as Gandiva would like it to be. So yeah, I think Gandiva is just like pretty good. A pretty good all-arounder that can like play into any matchup pretty decently. And it will just consistently do what it's trying to do every single game. Silhouette, the Susiomogus boy. I haven't seen enough of this deck. The one thing it is super consistent. This is one of the most consistent decks in Standard because you're able to just find everything instantly. I want to say it's like tier 2, maybe 2.5. I don't know exactly. We'll put in 2.5 for now, with it debatably being tier 2. It hits really hard, has a really strong Vanguard swing on turn 3, has really easy multi-attack to accomplish, has a lot of consistency, the ability to draw cards, and the ability to retire things. I'm gonna move it tier 2. I think this deck does have enough to like where it can fight. It's just not like the strongest at it, and there's just decks above it that basically do what it's trying to do but better. The one cool thing is if you hit a front trigger, then your Vanguard is just like insanely powerful. Your Persona Ride turn, your Vanguard's just really massive. This thing doesn't have triple drive and it doesn't have a crit. Silhouette not having a crit just makes it like not as great. You basically have to sack into a trigger, and since it doesn't gain a drive either, you're also not as easily sacking into triggers. So yeah, this deck just has like a really good foundation. It just needs its Vanguard to be able to like gain drives or crit in some way, but it does have just a ton of power it can spread out pretty quickly. Next is the 15k base. It got a card, does what it does. Yeah. Next, Stoicheia stuff. So Flagberg first. I think Flagberg's still tier 2. This deck is not great. I do think this is like a very like overrated deck personally, but it still like does things. Having 3 code guard restrict, pretty good. Retiring 2 things, pretty good. Drawing cards, pretty good. Restanding rear guards and attacking multiple times, pretty good. Inlet, pretty good. The issue with it is, one, this deck takes a lot of resources in order to like be able to use very easily. This deck doesn't have a strong early game unless you're doing the roaming prison dragon variant, and this deck just almost dies to damage triggers. There's basically like 2 ways to guard against it. You either want to guard all the rear guards and take Vanguard, or take all the rear guards and guard Vanguard. Damage triggers can really rock this deck's world, and it also doesn't like as much having its field retired. I think you'd probably play the roaming prison dragon build compared to like the normal just high combo Flagberg build, just because you can keep rebuilding a field through Gandiva retiring it all. So I think Flagberg's pretty like whatever. I can't see a reason to play this over most decks above it, other than like it can retire too. Magnolia, kind of same spot. If we do get that promo, then Magnolia's like a little bit better, because then you can cheat out your Elder on turn 3, and then the Elder can call something out right afterwards. So you can get like your defense easily pretty fast. Just like, again, this deck gets rolled by retire because of Gandiva. Now, yes, you can play N-Pix. N-Pix is like your way to get around that. You'd have to like play N-Pix plus Inlet Pulse to be able to like clear your field. So then you can clear your field, draw more cards, keep your field intact to be able to deal with Gandiva, and have N-Pix be able to protect some rear guards. But outside of that, this deck is kind of just like worse Ava for the most part. The one thing it does have is more attacks, while Ava has more crits. I think it's still okay. I just wouldn't expect like winning an event with this. Maelstrom, I think same boat. Same boat as Flagberg. This deck's turn 4 is a lot stronger than Flagberg's, but it's doing very similar things, right? Deck doesn't have as strong of an early game. Deck's turn 4 is pretty good, but it's not as good as like the Grey or Avantgarde's turn 4. This deck draws cards through Inlet and Maelstrom skill. Flagberg does the same thing. The like one big difference is that Maelstrom can keep reusing those Flagbergs. It isn't just gone forever unless you're playing orders. So Flagberg has to like basically play a bunch of orders and grade 3s for this deck to function. Maelstrom doesn't. Maelstrom just wants Inlet and Maelstrom in maybe the order, and the deck doesn't use nearly as many grade 3s or 0 shield cards, and even if it does, you have more access to Inlet earlier on. Now, Flagberg does have a stronger turn 3 compared to Maelstrom, but Maelstrom has a stronger turn 4. They both just have a pretty rough early game, so that doesn't super matter. But yeah, I think Maelstrom is still like okay for the most part. Granfia. I think Granfia is like tier 2.5. It's an aggro deck, but like the aggression this brings isn't much better than like PBO or Orphist, right? The like one big thing is you can play this with like roaming Prison Dragon, and whenever you play an order, you bring back Prison Dragon and give it a crit, and then you restand it with that crit to be able to have a really, really massive roaming Prison Dragon with a crit. That's basically it. It also can have a pretty decent early game because of all the tokens you're able to generate, and the Mushroom is an insane card. But yeah, I think it's just like not as great. Once Gandiva blows up its field, then it's just like pretty rough from there. Zorga. Zorga is 1.5. So this is the mask variant. It's pretty insane. It's also another deck that can get to the like power level of the Greya, but a turn earlier. So if you go second and then you ride Zorga and then you mask up into Zorga masks, then you're able to basically get 3 to 4 attacks depending on if you are playing the Dragon Tree version or not. And they're all gaining just like so much power because Zorga masks gives 10k to front row. The Persona Ride gives 10k to front row. Any potential orders you have gives more power through usually Psychic Miasma, which gives 5k power. And then there's also potentially Dragon Tree markers. So you can get like plus 25k power to your front row minimum. You're able to find your orders super easily through Shadow Cloak. So you can run just one mask and you have full combo. There's just a lot that this deck does. Also like roaming Prison Dragons early on, and like if you're playing the token variant, can just make this deck just feel so overbearing. So yeah, I think Zorga is still like really good. It's definitely the best mask deck we've got, and this like is one of the few ways that just shows you like how much power a mask deck can potentially have. So yeah, next, Leonore masks. Probably not the worst, probably the second worst mask. It's just rough. This deck doesn't have enough. It loses its drive check to instead have 2 extra front row rear guard attacks, which is pretty okay. It doesn't cost as much resources as the original Leonore did, but not having triple drive is pretty rough, and it's removed from game effect is pretty whatever. You just retire something, revive a grade 1 or less. If it could revive anything, it'd be a bit better. But yeah, this deck just relies on so many pieces, and then Gandiva board wipes it and it loses. So yeah, against other decks, it's still kind of whatever. It can have a pretty decent aggressive turn if you're playing with the mushroom, but outside of that, yeah, it's not as great. So next is Claudine. Claudine, I'd say, is probably tier 2 as well. This is a very interesting deck. I haven't tried it out myself that much. There's like a couple things this does. One, I think this can make the most use out of the like new order package that set 11 brought in, where you're able to find your blitz orders. You have more orders in your drop that you can bind, so then you can call out more plant tokens. You basically have Persona Ride turn on turn 3. If you have a field full of tokens, you have full access to like mushroom. Yeah, this deck is pretty okay. It has triple drive, restands a plant token, gives it a bunch of power. So yeah, I think this card's pretty good. I don't know what a full build for it looks like just yet, but just like looking at what this brings to the table and like how much plant token generation there is in this clan through Rora's initial stuff and then Granfia coming out, there's enough here to make this like consistently work. And you can probably play this like an aggro deck as well. And then because your field is kind of like fake stuff, because they're all tokens, it doesn't care as much about Gandiva retiring at all because they were all just tokens anyway. Now, yes, you're gonna have to rebuild those tokens, but a lot of cards in Stoicheia like call multiple tokens, so that shouldn't be as big of an issue as it might look. Rora, I think it's still also tier 2. Rora is pretty cool. The new grade 3 basically gives this deck like Pot of Greed, and then you're able to still keep your defensive capabilities on the opponent's turn because you ride back to original Rora. And this deck can like kind of play any style you want now. You can play it still very aggro like how original Rora was, and just like Momoke token, become really massive, attack with that massive power 3 times, kill the opponent that way. You can go a more mid-range build where you basically have that capability still, but you also have like more card advantage-esque effects where you can potentially rush with roaming Prison Dragon. You can potentially play defensive by like having your plant tokens out and then retiring them during the opponent's turn to be able to draw cards during your opponent's turn. Just this deck can kind of play whatever style you want. Having Rora gain a crit as well is pretty good. A lot of the time people would like guard everything other than like the Momoke token and such, but having your Vanguard gain a crit as well, and it also gives itself 5k power, so then on Persona Ride turn you're at 28, not counting a booster, just like makes this more threatening and makes the opponent have to guard more, right? And if they don't guard Rora, then they're having to take a lot of damage from that. So yeah, I think new Rora is pretty good. It doesn't increase the ceiling that much of the deck, but it's one of the better aggro decks out there with the potential of like becoming like different types of variants. I think this deck can be very flexible at what it can do. Then we have Mistiarch, I think that's the name of it. The sea creature deck, I think it's like 2.5. It kind of suffers the same issue as Leonore, where Gandiva blows it up and then like GG from there. This deck really needs a full field. Like the mechanics of the deck requires you to have a full field, and there's just too much removal in the format between all the Gandivas, all the Overlords, all the Messiahs, all the Jets. There's just so much potential removal in the format where it just makes this really hard. And the payoff isn't like that big. Next is like the common bosses. Tier 3. They're fun. They're silly. Shield Fisher is pretty wacky. I do think Shield Fisher potentially with like the order package could be 2.5, but I haven't tested enough to really know. Herminia, Tier 3. We're in the lyrical stuff now. Herminia still doesn't have enough. Very wacky deck. Hopefully with the next lyrical set, the new Herminia like makes this a lot better, because I think it as a deck is like pretty cool. It just doesn't do enough. Nearly enough. For tier, I think it's like tier 2. It's like Overlord, but instead of retiring things, you draw things, and you're able to bounce your rearguards back and keep up like a decent hand. So you're able to like sort of deal with Gandiva okay. But yeah, it just doesn't hit as hard as like any of the decks above it. Kyrie, man, I think this deck is so fake. The ability to bounce your rearguards and then have very easy multi-attack is pretty good. Having triple drive pretty good. This deck can like draw a bunch of cards. It just doesn't hit nearly hard enough. Like, why play this when you can play Thagreia, right? Like, Thagreia has a restanding Vanguard, draws 4 cards, gets 30k power to front row. Kyrie can maybe draw 4 cards. Doesn't really give that much power. Everything above it just hits way harder than this, and this is just like slower than all of them, right? So yeah, the one thing this can do is like be sort of aggressive and then have Kyrie just be like your top end on trying to end the game. But there's just like better ways to do that. Michu, tier 2. I think it's still doing the same thing. It still hits pretty decently well. Has 2 Vanguard attacks. It's kind of like 4 tier in a way, but hits a little bit harder and doesn't have as much card advantage. The Giant Girl, Lutetia. I think Lutetia's the like 1.5. It still can just high roll you out of oblivion. Restanding Vanguard, calling 3 units, bouncing things. But if this deck bricks, it's just miserable. And this deck can brick. Kind of struggles into aggro matchups because a lot of the time you want to like you want to be aggro as well, and you're dropping your hand down. And this deck just like doesn't have a hand early on. It like makes up for it later on once you start restanding and drawing cards off Lutetia. But outside of that, it's just a really fast deck. Rabbit Go, pretty whatever. Panago, whatever. I think Kyoka's like not terrible. It has a really strong, has a pretty solid early game and can also like have really big board buffs and can kind of build a field a little bit. But yeah, it suffers the same thing as most decks here. Gandiva just blows everything up. The ceiling of the deck is way less than most things above it. Restanding Go. This deck is probably like tier 2.5 as well. You can high roll into a restand, but why do that when you can like guarantee restand, right? And like the one like sad thing about this is it's not like optional. It's just if you find her to restand with, then you have to restand instead. If sometimes you want to like call a really strong rearguard instead. It's just like very easy 4 attacks. Clarissa, I think Clarissa's not bad. They just made it more consistent. I don't think that was the issue with the deck. It might have been. I don't know. I think part of the issue is this deck that also doesn't hit hard enough, which the stuff it got doesn't really help with that. But it's still doing what it does, which is drawing cards, giving power to Earnest Corrects units, things like that. And you can also more consistently get your order, which is pretty good. Alestial. Alestial's like power ceiling rose so much because now you can Raging Form from deck, go into original Alestial, have like minus power to the opponent, you gain a crit, all your things gain power, things like that. So I think Alestial can be pretty good and scary. It's just not better than a lot of the like restanding things before. Lorenerol, the new stuff didn't do shit for this deck. New Lorenerol is kind of whatever as well. Like it seems like a lot of the time you want to, because if you go into new Lorenerol, you aren't singing twice a turn, so it makes your grade 3 song like a lot worse. So yeah, I don't know. I think like the stuff Lorenerol got did not help this deck really at all. It might even be tier 3, but it might have made it like a bit better. Willista, this is the last tier 1 deck. It's the second best deck in the format. Potentially first. You can debate with it on Gandiva or not. This is just silly. I'll just fill out the rest. Felty, there, Asakura, there, Grifogila, Lamau. Okay, so, Willista, why is this deck good? Basically, the new stuff it got, you're able to just like draw a ton of cards. You have a ton of early aggression. You have a restanding rearguard that gains a ton of power. Willista herself is a ton of power. And you can do all of this by turn 3, which is crazy. And now you have the new gem, which counts as both the blue and the red one. So now, basically, you get all of the benefits for just having a better card. And then Willista is able to just vomit out a field as well. yes, it does care a bit about Gandiva retiring its stuff, but it can also regain that field very easily. And then you also have the like grade 1 that draws you cards whenever you play the order. So you're just drawing a bunch of cards for no reason. Like you can draw 3 to 4 cards off your order from those grade 1s. And then Willista just hits like a truck as well. It's got the full package, basically. And it doesn't have to work that hard in order to do what it wants to do. Minerva has to work a little bit because you have to find everything when you need to. Willista just has such a high power ceiling, and it's so consistent at what it does. Felty was the last lyrical deck. Felty is probably the second best lyrical deck. It's pretty good. They fixed the issue with original Felty where it didn't give any power and it costed a lot of counterblast to do what it wanted to do. But now the new Felty allows you to give power to your front row rear guards. Her attack itself is still not strong. It doesn't gain any power, but your front row rear guards at least will have power, and you will only have to counterblast once to do its effect. So you can pretty consistently get to really high pressure 5 attack turns turn 3. And yeah, a lot of the ghost cards were really good from before. Just like the main issue from before was that Felty herself wasn't that great of a Vanguard, but they just completely upgraded her, and now she's just like way better. And yeah, Grifogila is still a meme. Hopefully with set 12, there's some cool things. With set 11, it got a blitz order where you can get Dragon Tree markers earlier. So then whenever you ride up to grade 3, if you just used 1 blitz order at least, then you'll have 3 Dragon Tree markers. Then Grifogila was still having a crit as well. But the deck physically cannot have an early game because you are grade 0. Which is kind of bad because you just eliminate an option from the game. And then it's still like too slow. You're never going to make it to turn 6 to like get the over trigger. The way you play this deck is just by like having a really strong Vanguard column and potentially like rear guards that are high value as well. But yeah, anyway, that is about it. If you enjoyed this, have any thoughts about the video, let me know down below. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz, and I'll see you guys in the next one.